Hello, my name is Amy White. For this week's discussion, I reviewed two dissertations from the ProQuest dissertation database regarding American foreign policy in the 1990s, in particular regarding the effects surrounding the Rwandan genocide. The genocide itself typically overshadows the failures of the US and the international community to respond appropriately to the crisis. The first paper I reviewed was The Evolution of the Politics of Genocide: Why American Efforts to Prevent and Intervene in Sudan Failed, written by Shane A. Lesko at the University of South Carolina in 2013. Lesko laments the fact that war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide have defined human conflict since antiquity, noting the Israelites' movements out of Egypt with Moses to the Promised Land and Deuteronomy, and other acts of sheer lack of regard, to human life throughout the historical books of the New Testament, stating simply that genocide is not a new sin to plague mankind. Lesko's main argument stands on the challenge of inaction by the international community that followed the Holocaust, where many nations worldwide, including the United States, cried out "never again" as the images of the final solution were viewed around the world. Lesko then questions the implications from the United States, which had gone to such lengths through the proxy wars of the Cold War to uphold the values of democracy against the horrors of communism as an ethical response. But when real atrocities against human rights and civilian communities took place, those morals were simply not enough to solicit action or even help lead the international community into ratifying the UN Genocide Convention or any other quantifiable response or task force to stop the bloodshed. The scope of Lesko's paper focused on the American prevention and intervention in Rwanda versus the later Sudanese genocide in 2003, and began his historical analysis by discussing the efficiency with which the Nazis had used total war technology to forge a genocide against the Jews and other cultures in German society. Lesko believed that it was the United States' desire to revert to isolationist roots and step back from a central leadership role after the Cold War that led the US into a stance of inaction. And from that lack of leadership, the international community did not organize itself to provide an appropriate response in Rwanda, and the killings continued. Ultimately, the fact was that the last thing the US was willing to do at that time, following Cambodia and Bosnia and Somalia, they weren't willing to charge into another international dispute, despite the cruelty of the events taking place. In order to avoid action, the US became vague in their responses to the media, downright refusing to acknowledge the truth that genocide was taking place, and this provided a political excuse to essentially dodge the moral and legal responsibility that acknowledging the genocide would cause the US to ultimately intervene in Rwanda. Lesko concludes that the US needed to actively seek a stronger language in international humanitarian law and to insist other nations around the world, like great powers like Russia, China, and India, would utilize that power and encourage the United Nations and the ICC to really fight these injustices. Overall, I think Lesko's approach was solid and well articulated. The source material utilized diverse and well-rounded materials, including newspaper articles, journal articles, government records, international court records, and scholarly books. The second paper I reviewed was entitled "Why We Were Not There: American Intervention Policy and the Failure to Act in Rwanda" by Jeremy Ryan Lund of Iowa State University in 2011. Lund's article dives into the discussion describing the effects of the Cold War as well on the United States foreign policy agenda that sought to triumph democracy again over communism. Like Lesko, Lund noted the unique position of the US had as Cold War victors, and how this affected policymakers and how the international community now viewed the US, seeing the US as true global economic, political, and military leaders. Meanwhile, in the US, the government and the people felt like, hey, we've won the Cold War, we want to step back and pursue our own interests. And they hoped that through that, they would allow other world leaders to fill in the gaps of leadership. From this, the US then began to be more selective about interventions that they would support, owing to a desire to protect American interests, basically financial, economic investments and interests, rather than about people. The problem that with this approach was that within hours of the Rwandan genocide beginning, the US did nothing to assist the Rwandan people. They failed to offer military intervention as far as even just interceding with radio communications that was really fueling the genocide. And ultimately, the president at the time, President Clinton, resolved that the lack of action was one of his greatest regrets as president, and certainly one of the worst policies decisions in his administration. Nevertheless, Lund notes that the lessons drawn from the failure in Rwanda did lead to significant change in American intervention policy that was begun by George H. Bush. That mandated an immediate decision on the direction of American policy, because when the Rwandan genocide began, there was no real direction that they had to go in. They needed to have that pre-prepared so they could really get involved in a quick response, because the Rwandan genocide only lasted 100 days and hundreds of thousands of people were killed in that period. So quick action was essential. Overall, I think Lund's discussion was well articulated again and easier to read than Lesko's. I do think it was more rounded in his research, mainly because of the reference material utilized. He also used government documentation, journal articles, scholarly books, court cases, and even business reports citing financial aspects of international decision-making. But what really I think helped a lot was his newspaper articles were not just American newspapers, they were BBC and the Times and other international papers around the world that really gave you a more complete global look at it. So overall, I really found the articles or the papers helpful and interesting. And I look forward to hearing what you all think in the comments. And thank you for listening. Hope you have a great day. Thanks.